All right, welcome to another edition of New Wine Uncorked, and we're stoked that you're joining us this Friday. I guess Fridays are a big deal for a lot of people because it's the start of the weekend. For Phil and I, Fridays are just another day for reading and grading and doing, ministry and studies and things. And so, but it's the same today as it has been last week and the week before that. The only difference today is Pastor Jim was not able to join us, which we're stoked because he's doing. I mean, we're not stoked that he's not joining us. We're stoked that for what he's doing with the church work. And then Tony's going to be joining us in these upcoming weeks because he's still continuing with his church activities. And before we even started today, Phil and I were actually talking about like just the movements of the church historically. And if you've been joining us over these months, and so you know that some of the studies and the research that Phil's been doing is with the Black church. And today, when we're talking about the gospel, the idea of goodness really depends, I think, at least in my mind, on who defines goodness. And not only the defining of goodness, but then as we define it, how's our focus? Like, who is our focus? And so today's discussion is, so if the gospel is good news, what is this good news? But who is the good news for? For whom? And so I don't know about you, Phil, but like I've been looking and just taking a lot in, over these last few months, especially with the starting the year out with the movements and the attack on the Capitol and wherever perspective people come from that. And then this move into now July in where we're at with COVID and these new cases, and now the political movements of whether or not to get vaccinated and what to do about masking. And last week, as we were talking with Pastor Jim and the document of discovery and how the gospel so often is brought to people as this missional kind of mindset that we're coming and we're bringing you something and it's going to make things better. And it got me thinking, especially this week too, when people are talking about, with the committee and Nancy Pelosi denying a couple of Republicans and who were said to be a part of the January 6th. And then, so they're bickering about that. And I'm wondering though, are they thinking about our good? We elect these political representatives. They're supposed to be for the good of all, the common good. And Dr. Mesker, in his blog brings this up a lot, at the uncommon God for the common good, and what is the common good? And so how does the church though present the gospel news across the nation? And even if we just focus it on the Northwest, how is it that brings this news that's supposedly good to all people when if you just look out and you go out to the streets today, Phil, like if you and I go to a cafe, we're going to see disruption and division more so than we will see unity. So like, what is so good about this news? And if it's so good, why doesn't seem to be working in today's culture? Like, who is it for? If it does, I look out and I go, is the church not talking about the good news? Because it doesn't seem like people are happy about the news of the church. Who is it for?
That's a real interesting way of framing it, because I think when we look at the gospel, we believe it to be the good news going in, but how does it practically impact my life today? And then our country has a track record that it demonstrates that it hasn't impacted people in a good way. And so trying to overlook that while still calling it the good news without accounting for it, it makes it more painful than it does good news, but the reality of folks understanding, knowing that, how do I say this? Frame this as being where you're desperate and you understand that, God is a thing that you need central into your life. It becomes good news then. But until you kind of hit that point where you need the Lord in your life, it doesn't necessarily have to sound like good news initially. It can sound like okay news, along with every other religion that's out there that has some type of relief for the stuff going on in life, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the good news in the same way we frame it in the gospel. So
It's interesting too with the Olympics starting.
yeah.
That people look at the Olympics as kind of like the pinnacle of sports, and certain sports, I wrestled in college and then beyond. And for wrestling, really, the Olympics is the top. I mean, you have international competitions and things like that. And I was watching the soccer, and it's not the national teams, it's the under 23 teams. And so then it started making me think about this, do we sometimes, not that those under 23 dudes and all the men and women who are playing for the soccer teams, they made those teams, they're nationally ranked teams, and they've done well, but then that's not the national team. And yet, so does that mean that who we're sending to the Olympics are less than? Because how, like for the 23-year-olds, the 23 and under, and then they're allowed to have, I think, 3 mature players, which just means older folks that have more experience. Is that what we do with the gospel? Instead of giving the A team or the A message, this is the gospel message: redemption, reconciliation, love for all. We give this like secondary message that says, like what Pastor Jim was talking about last week or the week before that, where the white settlers went into the Native Americans, the indigenous folks, and they said, hey, you can be Christian. We want you to be Christian. You're in need, but you must lose this, this, and this. And so they give them the secondary message. And so what they're getting, though, is not the A team. Like at the Olympics, are we getting the best players, watching if they're the under 23, not taking anything away from them, right? Kind of like what they used to do with the basketball. Remember when they didn't allow for the professional players? And then when we allow our professional players to play, is that really fair? Put fair in quotation marks. I don't know what fair is with the Olympics. But so do we do that sometimes, like where we keep this like a message that's all inclusive and, hey, the money flowing in is for everyone. That's only though reserved for, I don't know, the elite Christians, the A team. And then we give the secondary message to everyone else.
Now both of us as seminary grads, right? When we went through seminary, we read Karl Barth, we read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we read Martin Luther, John Calvin. We read those things, but on that list, there isn't an African American on that list. There isn't a Native American on that list. There isn't an Asian American on that list. There's all these other ways that the gospel has been articulated from very, very brilliant theologians that we, unless we through a research paper, picked it up and decided to read through, then there's a whole lot of people out there. So yeah, I concur. I hear what you're saying when it comes to that, but I'm not sure that we know another way. I think that we form theology a particular way. We know the way the gospel should play out based on the resources that's been before us, and we don't have a much broader view of how to understand the gospel, how we see the gospel playing out. So we just don't look to those other sources. So yeah, we essentially send out the B team because all we know is the B team.
Yeah. So whose fault is that, do you think? Is that the seminaries? Is that professors? Is that presidents of seminaries? Is that the church?
That's the interesting thing, because for me, I've had a lot of classmates that would lament the notion that they weren't assigned a Black author, they weren't assigned a Hispanic author or anything like that all through grad school. And in some regard, I'm like, well, that's kind of on you.
Yeah.
You're right. Your
Yeah.
your guys didn't, the professors you had didn't assign those things to you. But for me, and I guess maybe that's where my story kind of comes in, it wasn't until like junior year in college until I really started studying civil rights movement, Martin Luther King's works, and trying to incorporate that into how I understood theology. And when I did it, I just plopped myself, at the basement of Multnoma's library, and just sat near the section with all the Black works for like it felt like it was more than a term, where I would just kept going in there and just sitting and reading more and more things, and then that kind of woke me up to it. And I'm able to see the connections a lot better. I'm able to use just different authors as I'm writing research papers and the like. So there's definitely something that's on the student to reach out to stuff, but at the same token, being at a college, you're there to learn, and you can
Yeah.
only learn in some regard, you can only learn as far as your professors will allow you to. So then there's other things that maybe your professor should be making you more aware to, and so that becomes on the school, on the people that's putting that curriculum together. And one more thing we'll say with that. One thing I did find after I graduated was there's a whole bunch of other schools and students that were thinking through some of the stuff I was reading in the basement by myself and incorporating into papers. And they had the luxury of being able to discuss some of these things in the classroom environment to be able to process some of their thoughts. Where as I emerged, I was simply just learning how to process the thought and how to think through some of it. So there's definitely a benefit to being able to have this in the classes where you have professors that are incorporating that thought into the perspective. So you can put it on the professor, you can put it on the student too, but at the same token, yeah, those who are putting together the curriculum, it needs to be more broad.
Yeah,
Definitely more broad.
it's interesting too because the basement of Multnomah Library, right? That one's like the
Yeah.
dusty books, right? You go down to the basement to find the good stuff that no one else is reading, and I'm like, this is not okay, right? But it made me think though, because if you do the basement reading and I do the basement reading, and then we both incorporate it, the problem that I have is that my life though hasn't been a lived experience of some of the stuff that I'm reading. Whereas you can go down there, you can read it, and you're like, yeah, no, yeah, I've experienced this. I know what he's talking about there. And then you put it in your writings and stuff, and you talk about it, and people are like, yeah, I do the same thing. And it still sounds like I know what because I'm using Cone, or I'm using King, or I'm using Cornel West, but I haven't lived it if I haven't been intentional, And so while we can have, and then because of the way the systemic evil has worked, even in our systems, you and I submit something for an article, 70% of the times my stuff is getting promoted or accepted as opposed to yours if they find out our backgrounds, right? That's how it has historically been, where even white folks reading about reading from Black theologians, Black historians, putting it in there though, still to me, I'm not saying it's disingenuous, because I want to account for folks that have not lived in the midst of that, still being able to understand it through the intentionality on their part. But I also want to press into that, like, hey, anyone hearing like, oh, I'm going to do that. I heard Phil talk about that. I'm going to go get those books and start reading. That's a good first step. But if that's all that we're doing, just reading about it, right? Because, dude, I'm sure when you read Cone or King or West or some of these theologians or philosophers, and they're talking about the history of Black and brown people, that you're able to nod and go, oh man, I felt it. I've lived it. How is it though that we get your felt experience and my felt experiences together, like our lived experiences, so that the goodness of the gospel can be for both you and me? That, I know it sounds cheesy, but it's not that it's colorblind. It actually sees the fullness of color in the full spectrum. Instead of seeing black or white, it really does see the rainbow, like it sees that beauty.
Yeah, it's definitely. Well, first off, that's definitely a question that I can't answer.
I thought
In part,
Pastor Jim said that you were filling in for the good of the Black people last week. Like,
absolutely, everyone was entirely sarcastic when he said that too. But
I had a,
but that's
I know,
definitely. But that becomes the charge. That becomes the challenge, and that becomes something that all of us have to kind of work at. Um, when I got introduced to how within New Wine we study theology, when we do from the Trinitarian thought, and the first thing I saw was kind of a theological backdrop for how you do urban or inner city missions, was the first thing I saw. I didn't see Karl Barth at first. I didn't see a lot of these things at first. But I saw a theological frame that said that brought community as always being a part of how you understand the community of God. The margins is always a part of how you understand the community of God. So one of the things that I think would help is talking about that perspective, because there were a number of Black students that I talked to that were at Multnomah at the time, where I would share with them about working in New Wine. And they're like, man, Paul's too brilliant. Paul is there's a lot of things people would say about Paul, so I'll just leave that there. But then I would say, here's what I saw. I saw
Yeah.
this underscore of how you do inner city missions. And they're like, what are you talking? Wait, what do you mean? And so I would just discuss how, yeah, community always being a part of it, where it's not a choice where I look to the other. It's like bound to the gospel is looking to the other, is
Absolutely.
bringing someone else into the circle. And how I would consistently say is inviting people to the party. So so that became kind of a thing that I understood as I was going through, but it helped me kind of see what we're talking about, the Trinitarian thought that we're working with differently. And it gave my perspective was just added to the conversation. And so that's one way of doing it, is what we have been doing, is consistently having people at the table sharing how they understand, how they see this, and knowing that some of that sharing becomes blind spots to other people. Because yes, before I truly started working with you guys, I had no idea what a Karl Barth was. Before this, I had no idea what a Dietrich Bonhoeffer was before any of this. So
Yeah.
so it found blind spots, and we just kind of work and live into that. But we still have to develop it though, and that's part of doing it through where you're doing master's level work, where we actually get to think through these things in a way and discuss them in a way that we can incorporate them into our theology. But then here's the turn, where then how do we make it? We still have the question of how do we make this real and lived out every single day.
Yeah.
And that becomes a thing that we work out. So sometimes being in the academy is helpful because you're able to think, but when it comes to the practical application of it, we still have to get there. So that becomes another thing too, is how do we bridge that gap from that high thought to the high level application of the same ideas?
Yeah. Don't, and that's the thing. I mean, I would imagine that's part of the draw that brought both of us and the many who are part of New Wine, is that lived out experience, because education is key for New Wine, consultation is key, but then the transformation, that third part, and that transformative truth only comes though when it's a cooperation, like you were talking earlier about. It's on the student and the professor, right? And so my son and I have been he's been going through some philosophers. He's reading Heidegger. We just got done with reading some the Critique of Pure Reason, but by Kant. And we're talking about this, like the relational truth. Like, I mean, Kant's talking about the relationship at first between space and time even. And in talking with my son, we were talking about how it's so hard to get out of this relationality because everything is related. And yet when we start pressing into our humanness, while I know I need you, I push against you so often because you represent someone who could take something from me. And so until that person sees the need of the other, that we're always going to be in contention with each other. And so when I was talking with my son, I was bringing up, talk about Bart. You're right. You get to seminary, and I remember the weirdness with New Wine is like there's certain things that you kind of whisper with everything, like this idea of engaging culture at the level of like, what, wait, you're going to go to the homeless shelter and you're going to go talk to the folks that live on the streets, and people are like, whoa, wait, you're going to go up to the bar, like, is that okay? And then and then you bring in Bart at like a pretty conservative, evangelical school, and they're like, whoa, wait, you're reading that? And then Bonhoeffer and all these things, you're like, whoa, why? And with that goodness of the gospel message, though, it's only good when you start to actually realize it's meant to be incarnated, right? That living out. But that's tough, because how can you do it if I live, the place that I'm at, let's say it doesn't have a lot of homelessness around, because the city I live in makes sure that they're not seen, and so if I want to go live it out, then I'm looking for someone to lead me. And that's where I'm just wondering, the church seems to be letting people down on the goodness of this gospel message.
Yeah.
Because what if they don't have a New Wine? What if I mean, new wine is limited right now. We would love to expand nationally and have a new wine hub at churches all across the nation. Right now, we don't, right? And we're fortunate with the ability to use YouTube like this and having students come into Multnomah and the Northwest and working with brilliant churches in that area. And we do have some new wine folks, North Carolina and on the East Coast. But right now it's like we would love to expand it, so we have to partner, and we want to partner with the church because each one of us is part of church. But what if the church leaders aren't expanding the gospel message because they don't even know the goodness of it? I've heard so much over the last year and a half how many pastors, because of COVID, are just like, they're done. If a pastor, because of a pandemic, it is washed out, does that mean that they never were bathed in the glory of the gospel? Because I just don't read, and I'm sure this is going to piss off a lot of pastors. They're like, oh, you don't understand. I'm a pastor. I understand. I don't ever read Paul, the Apostle Paul, or Timothy, or anyone saying, man, this last year's been pretty tough. I'm out, and we have a very sabbatical retirement mentality even within the church. And look, I mean, I take seriously and literally when Jesus says, oh, well, the world hated me. Guess what? It's going to hate you. I've just never been on any good side of hate. I don't know. I don't know if you've experienced hate where you're like, you know what? This hate feels just a little bit better than that hate. Like I really appreciate this hate. There's never been a time where I've been hated on, rejected, and I've gone, this is the good news of the gospel. And yet, though, isn't that part of being a Christian, this theology? We were talking about the pedagogy of the oppressed earlier, and the theology of the oppressed by James Cone and the some of his books. And nowhere in there, at least I've never read where people like they understand testing and trials, but it's not like even the Apostle Paul said, glory be to God. I mean, yes, it says, count it all good for the trials and the sufferings, but we have to be reminded to count it good. It doesn't come natural. So if the church leaders are checking out, how is it that anyone is going to ever get the good news?
Man, that becomes a big question. And our friend, there's two things I want to say here. So our brother Tony, if Tony was here, he would talk about us creating drama, creating hate. He would talk about that. We've created a problem that only we could fix. If no one accepts our solution, we're being hated. Yeah, that becomes a part of the thing. But another brother we think of is our brother, our brother in Jackson, Mississippi. John Perkins. We think of our boy John Perkins, our brother John Perkins, Dr. John Perkins. And the fact that throughout the year, people go down to Jackson to work with him for the year, or work with him for a span of time to see the work that he's doing. And part of that is that term relocating, and just being exposed to different understandings, exposed to different peoples. Those are things that we should be, these are things that if it's not incorporated in your studies of theology, you should be pushing for it. These are things you should be asking for. Can you go to a rescue mission, however far it is away from you? Go to a rescue mission and hang out with them for a week. The whole kind of youth student missions trip kind of thing. There's a group that was just at the harbor yesterday. That's a group of students from the East Coast that came to Portland to do a mission trip in town, found themselves at the harbor for an evening, hanging out with the men there. But there are ways to get exposed to different things. There are ways to get exposed to different forms of life. There are ways to get exposed to how Jesus has impacted different life. So, but that becomes the question. Do you do this just as a Christian? If your church is not doing this, do you leave your church, find another one that is? But let me say this before I pass it back to you. Burnout and self-care and figuring out how to manage that kind of stuff in ministry is a very real thing. And I can understand someone going through this past season, and at the very end of it saying, whoa, this wasn't something that I was necessarily signing up for, because we've painted ministry different, where this is a CEO job. You don't have to deal with trials. You're good. And this last year where you're just like, wait, why am I getting challenged from every single aspect? Well,
Yeah.
yeah, that was kind of what you signed up for. I remember going through my undergraduate program, and our director, oh man, I'm not going to say his name, but anyone who went through that same undergraduate program at our school, he was so mean to us for probably the first year of the program. He was so harsh, and it felt like he was just very brash with everything. But then by the time you got to the middle of the program, he was like, "Hey, I was trying to weed out the people that wanted to be pastors but didn't know what the cost would be." And after
Mm.
being in ministry for so many years, it is harsh. People are going to talk to you strange, and things are going to be rough. So I wanted to simulate some of that for you. And once he let us know that, by the middle of the program, things were a lot different. But it was that first year was so tough. And I remember I hung out with him about a year after I started pastoring, and his first question to me was, after the first year, do you still want to pastor? And I was like, yeah, this is what I'm called to. And I had a tough first year as well. And he was like, that's how you know you have the call, is that you're willing to take the difficulty and the harshness of that year and continue to want to do it. So that becomes it. We have to be conditioned. We have to be built for the harshness of what it means to be a pastor. So
When you were talking though, like this idea of the intentionality, okay, intentionality of people, and I get it, like the burnout, but this is where I think the lack of relationality plays into pastors then feeling so isolated, where the burnout becomes real. Like because I fully believe that there's no pastor who should or could be preaching 52 weeks if truly the word of God is what it says it is, right? And it's that heavy. Same thing with pastoral ministry. I don't think a pastor could or should be doing this on her own. I mean, if she's has the burden of going in, not only preparing the word, but then also meeting with people and teaching and discipling. I'm sorry, but you should expect burnout, right? And so that's where, when I bring it up, I'm like, I again, Tony's right. We've created drama for things that we can only create, like with push for retirement, with push for sabbatical. And then we're trying to get these rock star pastors up there, and we throw everything at them and say, hey, we want you to entertain us, we want you to educate us, we want you to lead us, right? But then also somewhat be our salvation, so we can go during the week and live how we want, but you're going to be our righteousness. So yes, but again, it goes back to even the intentionality then of missional living. Is that on the pastor for allowing it to get that way? Because they allowed the congregation to believe that the pastor is because when everyone is rocking your accolades and saying, yay, 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 how many pastors are stopping and going, like what Peter did or what Paul did, and said, do not worship me, I am only a man like you? How many of these pastors up front are doing that? I never see any of the ones that I see on TV. It's all about big. It's all about numbers and quantity. Quality, not so much, but then the quality seems big because what they tell us is good quality for church is what we see presented. And how would most people, I was talking with my wife, and we were talking about some of the stuff that we do with New Wine, especially with Uncorked. And I was saying, the tragedy in my mind is that I think 80%, 85% of folks who could watch New Wine videos, dialogues, would just nod their head and go, I guess what they're talking about from the Bible is true, because they don't know the Bible. Like the illiteracy of the Bible in some sense allows for pastors and theologians like you and myself to almost have a pass to say whatever we want, if in how many of us though really do have that holy fear, like, wait, I'm talking about Jesus, I'm talking about the Spirit, like I'm going to be held accountable for these words and what I'm preaching. And so then it goes back to, well, if the gospel is good news, who's it for? If the people that are being given the gospel message by the people who are giving it to us are not telling us that this is the goodness of it. They're saying it's good for us, but then they're defining why it's good for us. And part of the reason why it's good for us is because it benefits then the pastors who are telling us that, And so this lack of the church. So like moving forward and stuff, like how do we get that intentionality of the group coming out from the East Coast? I think it's awesome that we're getting exposure. I don't want that to be our missional living though. You know what I'm saying? Ooh, 2 weeks out of the year I go and I hook up with those people.
Real talk, absolutely, absolutely. And that kind of goes back to, I mean, you mentioned earlier that, yeah, if there's not a new wine at your, in your school, if there's not something in your church that's pushing you through there, how do you get exposed? So yeah, so there's ways to get exposed, but yeah, making it part of your lifestyle. One of the things that I find in working where I work now is the moment that I bring someone in there to hang out for just a day, just a couple of hours to hang out and just hang out with the men, take part in one of our chapel or something like that. And they're like, oh my gosh, I was expecting a bunch of, I don't know what they were expecting, but they wander in and they're like, this is great. We see the Lord moving, we see the Holy Spirit changing lives. This is what I signed up for. This is what I wanted to do ministry for. And a
Yeah.
lot of the pastors that I believe come in there is the same kind of thing where like they see the Holy Spirit at work in the lives of these men. They're like, whoa, wow, this is why I did this. Um, so with that being said, um, there is a level of you want to put blame on pastors for this, and let me explain what I mean a little more directly. I mentioned I pastor, you pastor. I remember probably it was sometime in the first year of me pastoring, I remember feeling, man, I can get up there and almost say anything, and
Hmm.
people are gonna like it. I remember thinking that, doing sermon prep, thinking I can almost say anything, and I just remember feeling like that's a scary place to be. How can I create accountability for myself so that I'm not doing that? And it's tough because I mean, at that point I was working, I was still in seminary, and I'm pastoring. And so I'm like, where do I get the time to get other people in my life to check what I'm talking about, to listen to me? So some of it I listened to myself, and that was painful sometimes. But then I got other people to kind of help along with the thought, listen to the sermons, and then come back and let's reflect and talk about it so I can get challenged and pushed. And that was difficult too. But developing accountability on your own and your own initiative, developing accountability so that you're actually saying things and continuing to preach the gospel and not just be edgy and lean in toward what's popular and what's not. That's a challenge. And that's definitely something that any pastor should do in some form or fashion. However you do it, do it. But the same token, the structure has built so yeah, you can create a rock star pastor and with no accountability at all that runs the church. The system is set up to do that. So it's going to produce that. And then the moment that you do have the rock star pastor there and they get challenged, they're gonna be like, what are you doing? You don't challenge this
Yeah.
role. you know? And so that's part of the structure. So it's twofold in the sense that the structure, we've accommodated it through the structure. We haven't we haven't challenged and pushed church leadership in that regard. But same token, as a pastor, I hope there's a moment where you look around and like everyone's applauding me. This should be a problem. like
Yeah.
everyone's okay with me. Like I haven't challenged anyone. This is I don't
And
know.
Tony talked about that. I mean, that's what I appreciate about Tony, is that the intoxication of the power. When you sit there, like you were saying, people are nodding, and afterwards they come up, and in the moment one person says, "Oh my gosh, that message that like really changed my life," and how many of us hold on to that, like, "Oh yeah, I'm really doing the Lord's work," which, hey, awesome, you're preaching things. But the mindset of, well, that's not you, it's the Spirit working. I mean, it is you, but it's the Spirit working through you, right? But that intoxication of power. And so then the good news is only good for whoever when I'm preaching, then I start to get people who are always doing that, right? And then anyone who's a naysayer or criticizes, we push them out, right? And if they're going to push back, and so then though, how long does that go until the church, though, once it gets to 2020, 2019, after 25 years of sitting there patting ourselves on the back, and then all of a sudden now this pandemic comes up, and racial tensions are at an all-time high, and the church is going, whoa, whoa, wait a minute, what's wrong? And now all these pastors, I've eventually it all comes home to have to be accounted for. And so if we spend years and years and years being super comfortable with our neighbors, is that what the church is meant for? I don't know if a church, and maybe you have a view of this, but if a church is in one town for 25 years and the town's not all Christian, I'm not saying that just because a church is there, but the number, and this is a weird thing because I'm not a numbers guy, but what would be the impact of a church in an area that's over 25 years? Would they have pissed everyone off? And so there's tension there because they're always pushing a message that doesn't go with the common good of society, or would everyone be, or a large majority of people would be saved and disciples of the church? If the church has a working relationship with their town, is the church the church?
Yeah, you know, there's a church in my neighborhood called oh my gosh. Oh man. First I would say First Zion AME, First AME Zion. It's not too far. It's been in that location since like 1920s,
Mm,
1917 around there. And one of the things I notice is when you drive past that building at night, you'll see people sleeping around the building. That
mm,
they'll and there's times where they'll give out needles. There's time you'll have people out there giving out needles, you'll have people out there giving out food, you'll have all these different things. And so if maybe if the town isn't if the entire area isn't Christian is one thing, but if people know that there's people here that care for me,
yeah,
and they'll go to that building. I think of downtown Portland, the number of old church buildings that surround downtown Portland, and the number of tents right now that are around that building, around those buildings. There's a few of them, because they know that these are people that care. These are people that are going to give
yeah,
resources. These are people that aren't going to kick me in the middle of the street, because I'm sleeping out here. That becomes a part of the impact too, and that becomes a thing. If your church can sit in an area for however long it does, however long it's there, over 20 years, whatnot. And yeah, the people in that neighborhood doesn't know that they can go and find the care and the love of God from that building. There is a problem there. And even
yeah,
though you may be doing good ministry, there's still some disconnection there. And yeah, I think of that too. I think of that too. I don't
yeah.
know exactly how to frame it, but I see that
And
too. Where
I
there's
think that's a great point. I mean, I didn't even think about that. That's such a brilliant point that people might not be getting saved because they still have free will, right?
Mhm.
The church is doing it, but they're saving them on other ways. And so while the town might not be all Christian, the people are hanging around the church because they know that the church gives them their need. I mean, that is a great point. I mean, that is huge. That's a pretty good indicator then the church is doing what it's meant to do. And then being criticized then by other Christians, I think also means that the church is doing what it's
Yeah, that too.
yeah,
Yes, that too.
because if you're a church constantly ministering to folks without homes and people on the streets or prostitutes or whatever, and you're giving them clean needles, I'm giving the 17-year-olds condoms, and that doesn't mean that I'm for sex outside of marriage. That doesn't mean that I'm all for intravenous drug use, right? What I'm for is for the other person. And sometimes I wonder though, if the first step is for us to see them and to it's a good point that you brought up. Like if people are hanging around the church and you're looking and you're seeing folks that are rejected by society, I guess that means that the church they're bringing salvation, right? So that's a great point. I mean, that's why I feel like the community is so necessary, because when we start talking and dialoguing, for me, it's expansive. Like you and Tony and Jim and Trudy and this is what's so brilliant about New Wine for me, is the collective thought process. So is if I feel unneed necessary is the need for action, you, Tony, Lynette, whoever other New Wine people go, well, what about this? Or how about this? And we're able to, it's not a forcing. It's a cool, sit with this and here's why we're doing what we're doing. And when you're ready, come join us, right? That invitation. I feel like that's what Jesus did. Never forced any of the disciples to follow him. He simply said, come follow me. And then they saw what he was doing, right? In word and deed. And I wonder if so many people see what the church is doing only and it's not even in word, it's more yelling. And that's destructive to the goodness of the gospel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let me say one more thing before I comment on your. I don't know if that church gives out clean needles, but like I said, I do see people around there where I think that's what's going on. So
Yeah,
I never
and
went and
the
asked
needle,
anyone directly, but I definitely
yeah,
have seen food. So let me say that because I don't know for certain that's what's happening. And also if people like I remember another church I was involved with years ago where there's a number of people that would call the church looking for help and stuff like that. So that's another thing. Um, okay, now there was something I was going to say about what you just said, and now I can't remember. So I'm just going to leave it alone. Go
that's
ahead and
good.
close. Go
And
ahead and close us
look,
out.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate we have to clarify, right? With needles, condoms, food, like there are a lot of things that, yeah, oof, not giving people something is sometimes the greatest love, right? Not providing. And so, yeah, I wasn't talking about that church, nor am I saying we should give out needles, condoms, things like this, but we should at least be understanding that people are using and right, like seeing the people, right?
But the reality of people know that there's people that care for me here. That's the
Yeah.
point. Is that
Yes.
when they see the church building, they know there's people that work here, that on Sunday morning, that they're Sunday morning, and that's the thing. If it's only a Sunday morning thing, that becomes a problem too. But
Right.
they know that if I encounter someone that happens to be associated with this church, with this area, that I know I'm going to experience the love of God being around them. Even if I'm not ready to accept Christ, I know that I'm going to experience God's love here. So I'm going to come here and yeah, I'll have my hand out and yeah, I may not be sober at the time, but you're going to treat me fair. You're going to treat me like a person. You're going to see me.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing. That's a thing. So yeah, and there's probably more, but that's just how I see it sometimes too, where it's like people know that they can experience God's love. That should be part of what we're about. So
Absolutely. And that's what we at New Wine continue to press into. And we're stoked that, hey, you were able to join us and that you did join us today, because we want to continue to press into this. Like, so the gospel's good. It's good news. It's good news for everyone. What does that look like as it rolls out and how we continue to share that with each other? And next week, we want to talk about this and step into the truth of this goodness being poured out for the sake of what then? We're talking about it, reconciliation with God, but the fact that the church can be the gospel message, and what does that look like? And so next week we want to continue pressing this, because New Wine's all about inviting folks in to that relational truth, so that together we can then figure out, well, what does it mean to be a participant on the world stage, right? And then take that next step, because first New Wine wants to put the question of, well, who do you say Jesus is, right? Because Jesus has come to say and tell us who we are. Question is well, what do we do with Jesus? And so that's our continual move. But as Phil was saying, we don't want to thingify. And so next week, we're going to talk about what does it mean to personify compared to thingifying. Dr. King talks about this. Dr. West talks about this. Bonhoeffer, Bart, like this idea of seeing the person or seeing a thing. And well, I might even bring in, because I like him, Dr. Seuss with thing one and thing two or something like that, right? But this is the talk, continue talk that we're doing. And so thanks so much for joining us this week. Next week, live again, Friday, 10 a.m. right here on YouTube. It's New Wine UnCorked. For Phil, I'm Matt. We'll see you on the flip side. Have a good one.